Well, it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't step on my blue suede shoe. Well, you can do anything but lay off my blue suede shoe. Yeah.
In the 1950s, critics called him the king of rockabilly, a country boy whose songs and guitar style helped weld hillbilly music to rhythm and blues. Records he wrote and cut at Sun and Memphis would become cornerstones of rock and roll. Elvis Presley would cover his songs. So would the Beatles and Johnny Cash. Eric Clapton would later say he learned to play guitar by studying Carl's records. When people talk about rockabilly, the purest distillation of that sound might be Carl Perkins.
Burn my house, steal my car, drink my liquor from an old fruit jar. Do anything you wanna do. Honey, lay off of them shoes. Don't you step on my blue suede shoe. Well, you can do anything but lay off my blue suede shoe.
Carl Perkins was born on April 9, 1932, near Tiptonville, Tennessee, not far from the Mississippi River. His parents, Fonnie Perkins and Louise Brantley, were sharecroppers. The family's first home was a 3-room shack on a cotton plantation. Later, they squeezed into a 1-room storehouse. By the time Carl was 6, he was in the fields with his older brothers, Jay and Clayton, picking cotton from the moment you could see outside to the moment you couldn't anymore. There were no safety nets, no child labor laws that reached into this corner of Tennessee, and the family's survival depended on every pair of hands being at work. Out there, he heard hymns and work songs drifting across the rows. Black and white families alike sang together, set to the rhythm of their labor. On Saturday nights, a battery-powered radio brought in the Grand Ole Opry from Nashville. Voices like Roy Acuff and Ernest Tubb cutting through the static. Perkins grows up at an intersection of cultures. White country music on the radio, black blues and gospel all around him in the fields and on the neighboring farms. You can hear that mix in every note that he plays later on. Carl's father did what he could. Too poor to buy a good instrument, he fashioned homemade ones and scavenged used guitars when he could find them. Carl learned to fret with big calloused fingers, imitating what he heard on the radio and from local black bluesmen who visited the farm. School was a part-time affair. For much of the year, work came first. But wherever there was a spare minute, on the porch, in the fields at break, or by the radio late at night, Carl practiced. That guitar would become his escape hatch. It wouldn't take him far at first. Just down the road, to a little honky-tonk where 3 brothers would stand together on a stage for the first time. As teenagers, Carl, Jay, and Clayton formed the Perkins Brothers Band. Carl on lead guitar and vocals, Jay on rhythm, and Clayton on upright bass. They played local honky-tonks and dance halls, often for little more than tips and beer money. The crowds were rough, farmhands and truck drivers, young couples with a little money to spend. On some nights, fists would fly. On others, the dance floor never emptied. The brothers learned fast what songs brought people to their feet. Fast hillbilly numbers, blues shuffles, and anything with a strong backbeat. The boys would play all night if you let them. Carl had a nervous energy that you could see in his right hand. A local radio station in nearby Jackson, Tennessee, began giving them airtime. Live broadcasts from tiny studios sent the Perkins sound out across the countryside, catching the ear of truckers and teenagers who'd never set foot in a honky-tonk. On the air, Carl's voice sounded older than his years, nasal and country, but with a blues edge that made standard honky-tonk songs feel just a little more dangerous. In 1953, he married Valda Kreider, the woman who'd share his life for more than 4 decades, and raised their children while Carl chased music's uncertain promises. Money was still scarce, but between the fields, the roadhouses, and the radio mic, Carl Perkins had built something precious: a sound, a band, and a reputation strong enough to tempt him toward Memphis, where a tiny label on Union Avenue was looking for exactly what he had. In 1954, word of a new kind of music coming out of Memphis drifted up Highway 51. At Sun Records, owner Sam Phillips had just watched a young truck driver named Elvis Presley turn country songs into something wild and new. Phillips wanted more of that sound, more rockabilly. Carl Perkins believed he could deliver it. The Perkins brothers scraped together gas money and drove to Memphis. In the cramped studio with its linoleum floor and homemade echo chamber, they auditioned for Sam Phillips, blending their honky-tonk twang, field holler blues, in the jittery rhythm that had begun to shake jukeboxes across the South. Phillips heard in Carl what he'd heard in Elvis, a country boy who'd been soaking up black music his entire life. The difference was Carl was already a band leader, and he wrote his own songs. Sun released Carl's first single, Movie Mag, in late 1954, a bouncy autobiographical tune about a girl he had to court by wagon because he didn't have a car. The flip side, Turn Around, showed off his more traditional country side. The single didn't chart nationally, but it earned airplay across the region. In the studio, Sam Phillips pushed Carl to play harder and lean into the offbeat snap that made his rhythm so compelling. They experimented with echo and mic placement. They changed arrangements, searching for the record that would catch fire. Then one night in a Jackson, Tennessee honky-tonk, Carl heard a man scolding his date about her shoes. Carl looked down and saw the boy's own shoes, blue suede, and already scuffed. It struck him as funny and telling. Here was a kid more worried about his shoes than the pretty girl on his arm. That night, the line stuck in his mind: "Don't step on my blue suede shoes."
Yeah, you can do anything but lay off my blue suede shoes. Well, blue suede shoes, yeah. Well, you can do anything but lay off of my blue suede shoes.
Later, Johnny Cash would claim he'd planted the seed for the song, telling Carl Perkins about a proud airman in Germany who guarded his blue suede shoes like treasure, and suggesting there's a song in that. But Carl remembered hearing Suede on the dance floor. However the spark was struck, the fire was his. On December 19, 1955, at Sun Studio in Memphis, Carl Perkins and his brothers cut the song. Producer Sam Phillips urged him to punch harder, to lean into the beat and the off-kilter syncopation. Between takes, Phillips suggested one small but immortal tweak: to change the lyrics "Go Boy Go" to "Go Cat Go." Sun released Blue Suede Shoes on January 1st, 1956, backed with Honey Don't. At first, Memphis and Jackson DJs spun the B-side more often, but then something strange happened. Phone lines lit up, and kids started asking for the shoe song. By February, Blue Suede Shoes was topping local charts. It climbed to number 1 on Billboard's country chart and number 2 on the pop bestsellers, blocked only by Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. On March 17th, Carl became the first country artist to break the R&B top 3, a crossover no one had seen before. Within weeks, the record was selling at a rate almost no one at Sun had ever imagined. By mid-April, it had moved more than 1 million copies, the first Sun single to do so, and one of the first country-rooted records to hit big with country, pop, and R&B audiences at once.
Well, how come you say you will when you won't? feel. Tell the truth, now is love real? Hey, honey, don't. Well, honey, don't bop, 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 bop. Honey, don't bop, bop, bop. Well, honey, don't. Hey, honey, don't. Say you will when you won't. Honey, don't.
Sam Phillips began plotting the next step: network television. The plan was simple and audacious. Put Carl Perkins on NBC's Perry Como show, hand him a gold record on camera, and introduce America to the man behind the shoes. On the night of March 21st, 1956, Carl and his band climbed into their car after a show in Norfolk, Virginia. Blue Suede Shoes roaring up the charts, and they headed north into the darkness. But they never made it to New York. Just before sunrise on March 22nd, on Route 13 between Dover and Woodside, Delaware, the Perkins Brothers band's car slammed into the back of a pickup truck and skidded into a shallow roadside ditch. In the cab ahead, a 40-year-old farmer was thrown into the steering wheel and killed instantly. Inside the car, chaos. Drummer W.S. Fluke Holland later remembered pulling Carl, unconscious, out of water that was already filling the ditch. Bass-playing brother Jay Perkins had suffered a broken neck and severe internal injuries. Carl's own injuries were brutal. 3 fractured vertebrae in his neck, a broken collarbone, a severe concussion, and lacerations over his body. He remained unconscious for nearly a full day. In a Memphis newspaper office, editors were preparing headlines about a rising star. By the time they went to press, the future was in doubt. In the weeks that followed, Elvis Presley performed Blue Suede Shoes on television again and again, on Stage Show, on The Milton Berle Show, and beyond. Elvis kept his promise not to release the song as a single while Carl's version was hot. But television did what television does. It put a new face to the song. Still recuperating, Carl watched from a hospital bed as Elvis, in a dark suit and those famous sideburns, kicked his leg and sang about Blue Suede Shoes. At home, the audience saw the kid from Memphis. Few realized the song belonged to a man lying flat on his back wrapped in bandages. Perhaps it's one of the great what-if moments in rock history. If Carl had made that Perry Como appearance, if he'd been the one on national TV week after week singing Blue Suede Shoes, maybe we'd remember the 1950s differently. But friends and fellow musicians didn't forget about Carl. Members of Elvis's band visited him in the hospital, carrying a telegram from Elvis wishing him a speedy recovery. Years later, drummer DJ Fontana recalled Carl telling him, "You look like a bunch of angels coming to see me." For Jay Perkins, the damage was deeper. He never fully recovered from that night in Delaware. A malignant brain tumor developed, and in 1958, Carl's brother and bandmate passed away. Another quiet casualty of a crash that had already altered the direction of American music. While Carl slowly learned to walk and play again, Blue Suede Shoes continued to climb. But momentum in pop music is merciless. By the time he could tour again, the moment had shifted, and the spotlight had moved. As he later put it, "I was a poor farm boy, and with shoes I thought I had my chance. But then I woke up in the hospital." In early 1958, with his Sun contract fulfilled and his confidence shaken by the crash, Carl Perkins followed his friend Johnny Cash to a bigger label, Columbia Records. On paper, at Columbia he cut tough little rockabilly sides like Jive After 5 and Hambone. They were records full of swagger, and some made a dent on the charts, but none caught fire like Blue Suede Shoes. During what should have been his prime years, Carl slid into a long battle with alcoholism. even as he kept recording and touring to pay the bills. Critics would later say he never again matched the spark of the Sun's sides. But listen closely to those Columbia years and you can hear a man fighting to keep his sound alive in a business that had already moved on. By the early 1960s, Carl Perkins, once on the brink of pop superstardom, was to many Americans yesterday's news. In England, however, a new generation of musicians was listening hard and memorizing every guitar lick. On the other side of the Atlantic, 4 young men from Liverpool were wearing out Carl Perkins records. In smoky clubs in Hamburg, the Beatles worked up blistering versions of Matchbox, Honey Don't, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. To George Harrison, Carl Perkins wasn't just another American singer, he was a teacher. Harrison later said he'd learned to play rock guitar by copying Carl's licks note for note. In 1964, Perkins toured Britain and discovered to his astonishment that the hottest band in the world already knew his catalog by heart. Backstage, the Beatles told him how much his music meant to them. When they asked permission to record his songs, Carl laughed and said, "Man, go ahead, have at it." On their 1964 album Beatles for Sale, they cut Honey Don't and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, giving Carl's Rockabilly classics a new life on the biggest stage in pop music. They'd already recorded Matchbox earlier that year. Those royalty checks mattered. Carl had been through a long slump, personally and professionally. The Beatles covers not only validated his work, they brought in money he really needed. The connection lasted a lifetime. Later on, in 1985, Harrison and Perkins shared the stage to revisit Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. Also in the mid-1960s, Carl Perkins found a lifeline in an old friend, Johnny Cash, riding high on hits like Ring of Fire, invited Carl to join his touring show as a guitarist and opening act. For the next 10 years, Carl crisscrossed the country as part of the Johnny Cash Road family. Both men were fighting their own demons, Cash with pills and Perkins with alcohol. On long bus rides and in motel rooms, they would talk about faith, failure, and the people they'd disappointed. Cash later wrote that after he found God and got clean, he made it his mission to help Carl do the same. In 1967, Carl channeled those conversations into a song about family and redemption, Daddy Sang Bass. Borrowing lines from the old hymn, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, he wrote of getting together in a family circle, singing loud to heal troubled souls. Johnny Cash recorded that song in 1968, and the single hit #1 on the Billboard Country chart, staying there for 6 weeks and spending 19 weeks overall. One of Cash's biggest country hits, and one of the most lucrative songs Carl Perkins ever wrote. On the Johnny Cash Show, Carl sometimes stepped forward to play and sing on Daddy Sang Bass. It was more than a gig, it was a living testimony to the family he'd found on the road. By the early 1970s, Carl credited his Christian faith and Cash's friendship with helping him finally get sober. He would later say that he'd spent too many years with a bottle in his hand and a chip on his shoulder, and that he was grateful to live long enough to put both of them down. In the mid-1970s, Carl Perkins settled more firmly in Jackson, Tennessee, the town he'd long called home. Clean and refocused, he poured his energy into family, faith, and a new phase of his career. He formed a new band, CP Express, with 2 of his sons sharing the stage and the road with the next generation of Perkins pickers. Around the same time, he launched his own label, Suede Records, trying to control his music in a way he'd never been able to in the 1950s. He also became a small businessman, owning 2 restaurants, and working with the Jackson Exchange Club to establish the Carl Perkins Center for the Prevention of Child Abuse, turning his name recognition into concrete help for vulnerable kids. In recognition of his work and musical legacy, Jackson eventually renamed its civic center the Carl Perkins Civic Center, a physical reminder that the kid from the cotton fields had become the town's most famous son. Through it all, Carl kept playing, touring Europe, appearing in Rockabilly revival shows, cutting new albums, and joyfully trading solos with younger guitarists who had grown up studying his records.
Yeah, rock it, let's do it. Yeah, do it. Well, that's all right, mama. That's all right with you. That's all right, mama. Anyway you do, don't you know it's all right? Don't you know it's all right now? That's all right now, mama. Anyway you do.
By the early 1990s, Carl Perkins had lived more than one life. Farm boy, rockabilly king, nearly forgotten pioneer, born-again survivor. But time and the road had taken their toll. Doctors diagnosed him with throat cancer. For a man whose voice had carried him from cotton fields to concert halls, it was a terrifying verdict. Treatments were grueling, but Carl fought through them, and he won. He emerged a cancer survivor, determined to keep playing. Once strong enough, he went back to the road, touring with his sons and fronting the CP Express, leaner in frame, but still attacking the guitar with the same snapping right hand. Behind the scenes, his body kept sending warnings. In the mid-1990s, he underwent a procedure to clear a carotid artery, a procedure meant to prevent strokes. The operation bought him time, but not enough. A succession of strokes soon followed, chipping away at the strength that had carried him through tavern fights, car wrecks, addiction, and cancer. Friends and family remember good days and bad ones, moments when the old spark flashed in his eyes, and others when speech and movement came hard. On January 19, 1998, in Jackson, Tennessee, Carl Perkins died at the age of 65. At his bedside was his wife Valda and their 4 children. The man who once thought he'd spend his life in the cotton fields had gone farther than he'd ever imagined. Now in the town that had claimed him as its own, the music fell quiet. Carl Lee Perkins never had the pop star profile of Elvis Presley, the chart dominance of Jerry Lee Lewis, or the dark mystique of Johnny Cash. But in the story of rock and roll, his fingerprints are everywhere. In 1985, he was inducted into the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame. And 2 years later, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame followed, citing his role as one of rockabilly's founding architects. He would also be honored by the Rockabilly Hall of Fame, the Memphis Music Hall of Fame, and others. In 1986, his original 56 recording of Blue Suede Shoes entered the Grammy Hall of Fame, recognized as one of the recordings that helped shape rock and roll. Everywhere rock and roll is played, from Tokyo barrooms to Memphis revivals, there's a little bit of Carl in the air, that blend of country and blues, the joy tucked inside the backbeat, and the sense that a poor kid with a beat-up guitar can for 2 minutes sound like the biggest thing in the world. He did not become the household name he briefly seemed destined to be. Instead, he became something quieter, and in some ways deeper. A musician's musician, a songwriter whose work outlived him, and a hometown hero who turned his second chance into service. From a cotton row in Lake County to the walls of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Carl Perkins proved the big things can grow from the hardest ground. All you need is a guitar, a beat, and a pair of shoes you're willing to stand your ground in.
Well, I'm sitting here wondering what a matchbox hold my clothes. Oh, baby, I'm sitting here wondering what a matchbox hold my clothes. I ain't got no matches. I got a long way to go.